If you look at most moral theories, deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, the ethics of care, these are theories that are known as moral realist theories, and they're called that because they think that moral facts are a real thing that exists in the world. Kant, for example, really thought that it was universally true, always and everywhere for all time, that if you wanted to be a good person, you needed to behave rationally. But have you ever thought that talking about morality is just a thing we do to keep people in line or to enforce social codes or things like that? It turns out you're not alone. And if you've had that thought, you are thinking about a theory that's known as moral anti-realism. Moral anti-realism pushes back on these moral realist theories, and it does so by saying you need to answer a really simple and straightforward question. How exactly do we know moral facts? How do we know that moral facts even exist? And the moral anti-realist is going to hang their hat ultimately on one of two claims. Either, if you really stop and think about it, moral facts don't actually exist, or even if moral facts do exist, there's no way that we could actually come to know about them. Now, it's very important to say what moral anti-realism is, this idea that either there are no facts or we can't know what they are, but I think it's equally important in this case to say what moral anti-realism is not. For example, you might notice that there is a lot of disagreement in the world about moral claims. You might think, for example, that abortion is a grave moral evil, and I might think that abortion is perfectly morally permissible. Or you might think that people who are the descendants of enslaved individuals should get reparations, and I might think that that is actually inappropriate. That's moral disagreement, and simply noticing that moral disagreement exists is not a reason to think that moral anti-realism is true. Just like we might disagree about facts that are out in the world. You might say that the earth is rounded, I might say that the earth is flat. Simply because there is disagreement is not a reason to think that there is no underlying fact of the matter. It could just be that one of us is mistaken. You might also notice that a lot of us are very committed to the idea of tolerance and respecting other people's views. Now, this is really good, but I also want to be clear here that simply saying that we should be tolerant of other people's views in general is not saying that there simply are no moral facts. We might recognize that we are simply fallible people who might be wrong, and because we might be wrong, we should be willing to recognize that other people might be right. We might notice that a lot of what seems like moral disagreements aren't actually disagreements about actual moral claims, but about sort of cultural claims or claims about how we should actually take these moral claims and put them into action. Moral realists are, in fact, generally speaking, very in favor of tolerance. So this is not what anti-realism is. Anti-realism is not looking around and saying, oh, there is disagreement, and so there cannot be moral facts. And it's not looking around and saying, if you want to be tolerant, the only way to do that is to be an anti-realist. The anti-realist is making, again, a very specific claim. Either there simply are no moral facts, or there's no way that we can come to know about these moral facts. Now, the question you might ask is, why would an anti-realist think this? And the anti-realist argument often comes down to something that's called the argument from strangeness. And the argument from strangeness basically goes like this. It starts off by saying, if you want to be a moral realist, then you have to believe in this idea of universal moral facts. But if you stop and think about what a universal moral fact would be and what a universal moral fact would look like, this would actually be a really strange sort of concept. And it's okay to believe in strange concepts. We believe in things like, some very strange subatomic particles, for example. But the only reason that we should believe in these strange concepts is because we have really, really good reasons to think that these concepts actually exist, that these claims really are true. And if you stop and think about the idea of moral facts, you come to see that maybe we don't actually have the good reasons that we would need to believe in them. And so if we shouldn't believe in moral facts, then we shouldn't be moral realists. Now, you might ask yourself, how is it that moral facts would be different from other kinds of moral facts? And the answer is actually pretty straightforward. When you think about a normal claim that we would make that we would say is a fact, for example, you are watching a video with me in it. I am in my office right now. I am wearing a navy blue shirt. When we think about claims like that, when we say that they're facts, what we seem to mean is they are describing the way that the world actually is. It really is the case that I am wearing a navy blue shirt. It really is the case that I am in my office. It really is the case that you are watching a video right now. To say a moral fact is true, though, doesn't seem to be to describe the way the world is. Instead, it seems to be describing the way that the world ought to be. When I say that murder is wrong, I'm not saying there are no murders in the world. There certainly are. What I seem to be saying is, in a perfectly just world, it would be the case that there would be no murders. And if you stop and think about the way that we talk about moral facts, it seems like all of our moral facts seem to describe the way that the world ought to be. And it seems like all of our other facts seem to describe the way that the world actually is. And if we have this one very special kind of fact that doesn't describe the way that the world actually is, and only describes the way that the world ought to be, maybe it's not actually a fact in the way that we think it is. Now, the second way that you might think that anti-realism is true, that, moral realist claims are in some way strange, is to ask yourself, well, even if these facts did exist, how would we even come to know them? And the moral anti-realist says that if you think about it, we really don't have a good way to come to know moral facts. For example, take the fact that I'm in my home office right now. How do I know that I'm in my home office? Well, I would use my senses to look around and see the bookshelves behind me, or maybe I can touch my desk, or maybe I can use my other senses to confirm the fact that it really is true that I'm in my office right now. How do I know that I like hamburgers? Well, I eat a hamburger and I have this sensation of deliciousness in my mouth. I have this mental experience that tells me, Jake, you really like hamburgers. But if you think about it, why would we come to know these claims? Why would these be reliable ways of coming to know about the world? And a lot of times we say something like, well, it's very useful for example, evolutionary purposes, to be able to reliably know something like there's a desk in front of me so I don't run into it, or know something like hamburgers are delicious so that I can, eat nutritious things that will allow me to survive. But if you think about moral facts, there's no clear reason why we should think that we would actually be able to know what moral facts are using the normal sorts of ways that we come to know about the world. I can't exactly, observe a murder and point to something and say, yes, I see the wrongness right there. There is the badness. There is the immorality. And I can't even necessarily stop and think about the badness of murder. If I stop and think about how I feel about murder, for example, it seems to tell me something very important about how I feel. But it's not clear that how I feel necessarily is the way that the world actually is. It doesn't necessarily tell me something about what the universal moral facts would be. And if that's the case, it seems like it's not clear that even if the moral facts exist, I could actually come to know what they are. Now, this is a very serious challenge for moral realism, and the moral realist really needs to stop and think, well, how would we actually come up with these moral facts, and how would we come up with these accounts of how we could actually come to know them? And to the moral realist's credit, most moral realist theories do have explanations for how this works. For example, the utilitarian will say, well, if you look around, it just seems obvious that happiness is good, and we should want to create more happiness. That doesn't require any sort of strange way of knowing about the world. We all value happiness. And Kant says, well, we can come to know what the moral facts are by using our reflective abilities, by thinking rationally and critically about what the right thing to do is. The question that you have to answer is whether you find these particular responses compelling, whether they answer the question, whether they answer the challenge that the anti-realist has posed. But I also don't want to suggest that the anti-realist has no questions of their own that they have to answer. They do. And maybe the best, most well-known challenge to anti-realism is the idea that if anti-realism is true, then there are no moral facts. And if there are no moral facts, then there is no right or wrong. Now, this sounds okay, and this is sort of one of the things that this idea that we should be tolerant is often based on. But if you really stop and think about what this claim means, it winds up committing you to some positions that may be at the very least uncomfortable, and maybe even positions that you don't want to adopt. For example, we normally think that there are some things that are sort of even if we have disagreement, even if we are in favor of tolerance, obviously wrong. For example, the Holocaust was obviously wrong. We like to think that the Holocaust was one of the gravest moral evils that has taken place in human history. But if you're a moral anti-realist, you can't make that claim because there are no moral facts. The Holocaust wasn't wrong. It also wasn't right. It was just an event that happened. And it seems like that's not really a claim that many of us necessarily want to accept. And if you're an anti-realist, It's a claim you have to accept. So if you're an anti-realist, what you're going to have to explain is either why we shouldn't actually be troubled by the fact that the Holocaust wasn't actually right or wrong, or come up with some reason why we would never actually make that claim. And it seems like for the anti-realist, both of those are going to be very difficult questions to answer. So ultimately, here's what we're left with. We're left with a moral theory, anti-realism, that says that either there are no moral facts or there's just no way for us to come to know about them. And their challenge is that it turns out that when we think about facts, moral facts seem to be different from other kinds of facts, and that's a reason to be suspicious of them. Or the way that we would come to know about moral facts doesn't seem to match up with how we come to know about other facts in the world. Now, does this mean that we should be moral anti-realists? Maybe, maybe not. I have my own views, but the point of these videos isn't to share my views with you. It's to share with you, the various reasons why you might or might not adopt these different positions. What I hope you'll do is I hope you'll take this and you'll think critically about it, and you'll be able to think more about what exactly you think the moral fact of the matter is.